Today we're going to work on the multiple pamphlet stitch. I have 30 sheets of half letter size sheets of paper cut down. It doesn't really matter what size they are, but there's 30 of these. And I've stacked them together, folded them in half and stacked them together in 5 signatures of 6 pages each. The amount of pages isn't all that important, but you'll see that the measurements of the thickness of each of these signatures is going to be important. So go ahead and fold those and make sure you have a nice crisp fold in those signatures. We can go ahead and give ourselves a little bit of an estimate. Well, a lot about this binding is math. And we're going to be working with about 1.5 centimeters of thickness. So what we can do is we can go ahead and we can fold our cover, which is going to be this piece here, and we can fold it off center by about 1.5 centimeters. We'll get down to the exact precision of this very quickly, but this is what's going to serve us right now. And then we're going to begin our math. So I have a piece of scrap paper here to do some math. And this is also, I'm going to use this later as a template to punch my punching jig. So the math part about this binding is the tricky part. I want to talk a little bit about how I came to the conclusion of the numbers that I did. So the first part is you take your stack of signatures, your text block, and you want to give it a squeeze. And you want to measure the swell of your text block. And so where you're measuring is basically this area that has, I want to make sure you can see this area that has a little bit of puffiness to it. You can see that there's little air gaps left in there. So we're going to go ahead and measure that. And I come up with 12 millimeters. So I wrote down 12 millimeters on here. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the thread that I'm going to use to sew, and I'm going to wrap it around my pencil. I have 5 signatures, so there's 5 wraps around my pencil. And I'm going to mush those together. And I'm going to measure the thickness of that as well. And that's about 3 millimeters. It's a little bit more than that. And this thread has a little bit of variation to it. So initially, when I first started doing this binding, I would just kind of guess at what that number would be. But after a while, I figured out that if you measure the swell and you measure the thread, you can come to a much better conclusion. So in theory, we need a 1.5 centimeter thick spine. But I also like my math not to be very complicated. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break my spine up into the 0 mark, which is going to be the fold. So this is going to be my 0. And then I'm going to measure over 2 millimeters, 5 to 8 to 11 to 14, and then 16 millimeters. Obviously, it's not going to be here. And then I'm going to fold at the 16 millimeter mark, and that's going to get me enough space to work with comfortably so I can punch holes so we can have a nice pattern on the spine. The math will make a little bit more sense when we begin sewing and you start to see the pattern. But right now, for what we have, the materials that we're working with, this is our good math. It's about 1 millimeter more than the exacting math of this. And that's okay, because having a little extra room, 1 millimeter extra, is not going to harm anyone. If you're going to have extra flaps folding in to your book as well, you would want to add a little bit more accommodation, or if you're going to add a pocket at the end of your book, for example, more accommodation to that spine. All right, so we're going to begin using this math. So starting at my fold, I have measured, that's my 0 mark. Then I've measured 2 millimeters from there, an additional 3 millimeters for each increment until I get to this one, which is Now 14 millimeters from this beginning line, and then I'm gonna measure over here, which is 16 millimeters to this line. I'm going to then connect those measurements, and I've done the same thing on both ends. Very carefully I'm gonna connect them, and having this be accurate is quite important. Have a very sharp pencil when you do this. Precision is key to making this look nice. And this last one, I don't need to draw on necessarily, but I do need to score and fold here. So I'm gonna make sure that when I do go ahead and score and fold, that I'm scoring on my pencil line and not in a different location. So now we have a spine, and that's what it looks like on the inside. Our next task is to fold the spine piece. We know that it needs to be 16 millimeters at least, but it also has to fit on the outside of this spine, which means it's gonna have to be a little bit bigger than 16 millimeters. To get this measurement, I usually just find the center, and then whatever this number is that I need, I divide it in half and measure half this way and half that way to get my number. So this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure over 8.5 millimeters. Because usually with this paper, it's about 1 millimeter bigger that I need to make this work. Okay, so I'm gonna score and fold at those 2 points. I just want to make sure I fold it square. You want this to fit nice and snug on the outside of your other cover. Now, if I've done this right, that seems pretty snug, I should be able to pick this up and it should stay somewhat attached. It slipped a little, but that level of slippage is okay. Sometimes what happens is you don't fold straight, and one end will have extra material on it. You just have to kind of fix that as best you can, figure out what the problem is. This is rather snug, so I'm happy with that. So I'm gonna leave that as is. My next step is to determine where I wanna do the punchings on my text block. And today, what I'm gonna do is, I'm just gonna kind of keep it simple. I'm gonna do 3 holes. So as promised, this is now gonna double as my punching jig. And this is just a piece of photocopy paper, just scrap. here on my ruler. I'll just come in 2 centimeters from the head and tail, and I will come in, let's say, we'll do this a little asymmetrical so it'll be more distinct. I'll come in 8 centimeters from the tail. So again, that was 2 centimeters, 2 centimeters from here to here, and from here to here. And then this is 8 centimeters. I'm gonna go ahead and punch all of my signatures. The next step is to punch your spine. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna show you how to do this measurement so it keeps it a little bit more simple for you. I'm not using my jig to punch my spine, I'm just using my jig as a reference to the math. So I come in from 2 centimeters there and 8 centimeters here, and then 2 centimeters from this end. Same down here. And then I'm going to connect those areas. You actually don't have to connect these areas, but I like to because it's easier for me to show you where to punch your holes. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna punch at the intersection. Now you just have to keep in mind you have 5 signatures and you're gonna be punching at these places. What's important to remember is you're not punching on the folds. It's easy to get a little bit exuberant about this part and accidentally punch on the holes. And I'm gonna worry about larger holes in a moment. Okay, so that's my inside, and this is my outside. I am gonna take a very small piece of double-sided tape, and you can use more than one if you feel better about this. This is an optional step. I like to put this double-sided tape on here because this spine can sometimes get a little squirrely on you. And what's important is that you just don't place the double-sided tape over your sewing stations. If you do, it can cause you some trouble. It's already being squirrely, see? So what I would like to do is I would like to nest my spine around my cover paper and make sure there's good contact in there. And I'm just gonna double check to make sure it's actually in the right spot, which it is. And then I'm gonna make sure it has good contact too. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my awl and I'm gonna go back through those holes. And I'm just gonna punch them all over again so that they're now coming out of this peach paper. And at this point, I do want to talk a little bit about the ability to do pattern making in here. You can make this very complicated, but for today's binding, I wanted to keep this simple for you. You can make incredibly elaborate patterns and design work with the stitching. Not all of the holes and not all of the signatures have to be punched in the same format. You could have a design where it's graduated. You could have an arc, and you can do some more decorative things with it. So this is a very versatile binding. It is kind of fun to play around with. And the other thing that I like to do is then come over here to the good side and punch in those holes, because sometimes when you punch, the exiting direction has a volcano, or sort of where it's blowing out. And I'll show you what's happening on the inside instead. And you're gonna have to go through here with a needle anyway, so it's nicer to just open these up while you're not sewing, stressing about the sewing portion. The reason why we've added this extra spine, I want to talk about that too, is it's for extra reinforcement. I've seen people use all manner of things on the spine instead. I've seen people use wood. I've seen people use Tyvek. Tyvek doesn't tear so easily and it's waterproof, it's very thin. And you can put that on the outside or the inside depending on what you want it to look like. I prefer this method because I think it's important just to be able to wrap one sheet of paper around another when they're folding. And that's a skill that I like to be able to hand over to my students. We're going to begin the sewing portion of this book. The way that we're going to sew this book is basically in 5 distinct pamphlets. To sew a pamphlet stitch, you need 2 lengths of the spine worth of thread, plus a little extra to tie a knot. And then I'll do something a little bit different with the other pages. And hopefully I can get this threaded rather easily today. Again, there's no knot on my thread. I'm just gonna try not to have it fall out. And if you do not want these pencil lines in your book, this is the time to erase them. While you're in here and erasing, it usually kind of buffers down those volcanoes slightly. So you just want to make sure that your holes line up with your signatures. And I'll just orient everything like that. We're going to start at one side and we are going to work our way over to the other side. Depending on the pattern you want to do, you can start in the middle and then work your way out. I've done that before too. Just depends on the pattern. Today's pattern, we're just going to start over here. And the only thing you really need to be careful of on this portion of the binding is just to make sure that you're sewing in your row and you don't switch rows by accident, because you want to make sure you have enough holes to get done your entire binding by the end of the book and you don't end up with a signature that doesn't have a way of attaching itself. So I went in the center, I've left a tail. I've sewn up to the head of the book, or maybe that was the tail earlier. I don't know, they switch sometimes. There, now it's the head. I am now switching directions of sewing, and I'm coming back in and I'm jumping over my central sewing station. If you need a refresher on the pamphlet stitch, I have a tutorial video about that as well. And that's all this is, truly. I am now re-entering my text block here, my signature. And this is where I'm going to tie my square knot. If you do not know the square knot, there's another tutorial on YouTube, and you can check that out as well. And I'm going to give it a little haircut. I am done with the signature. I will not be entering that row of sewing holes anymore. And I have these two beautiful stitches on the outside of my book. Basically, we're going to repeat that. And I'm going to show you two different patterns while I sew. So this time I'm threading on a longer piece of thread just so I don't have to keep cutting the thread and tying the knots. Again, you want to make sure your holes line up. So I'm just going to start that back from the beginning again, reset the cycle. Starting in my middle sewing station here, and I'm just in that second row now of holes of sewing stations. Re-enter the book. Leave a nice little stitch out here. Oh, and I forgot I was gonna do, I'll do this part as the decorative one, the other day. I was just gonna switch the decoration here. Hopefully I remember next time around. Okay. And I'm gonna drop down to the bottom. And this is where I'm gonna do my decorative stitch. I'm just gonna link over to this stitch that's already there in that first run, and I'm just gonna drop back into where I started from. And we're not gonna have too much of a pattern here at this point because we've only done one decorative component. And this is the downside of sewing with a longer thread. You tend to get knots or kinks in your thread when you do this. An option here is to add beeswax. And that usually prevents some of that knotting or kinking. So we have this little decorative thing. Again, I'm gonna sew my square knot here. It's important that my threads are coming out one on either side of that stitch. If you need review about the pamphlet stitch, again, there's a tutorial video posted on here as well. A little trim, and we'll move on to the next signature. Again, make sure those holes line up. Enter through the middle of your text block and then out the spine. Again, we're now in the third row. Pull this in, leave a little tail. It's getting a little squirrely on me. I am going to, how would I like to do this? I'm just going to keep this in stripes up here today. And I have just spilled my thread. So I'm going to try that again. Start this signature over. Fuzz that's in there out of there. And then this is the point we're going to do our decorative stitch. So previously we did our stitch close to this end. This time I'm going to do my stitch closer to this end, and you'll see why that's important in a second. I'm going to walk it over here a little bit more so you can start to visualize that better. And I'm back on the inside where I'm going to tie my square knot. And don't panic about that outside pattern yet. It establishes itself after a few stitches. We are going to move over to the next signature. Again, make sure those holes line up. And here's our decorative stitch. So this time we're going to go back over here towards this side. We should be able to see this pattern starting to establish itself. And back into the middle where we started. There we go. Sometimes it's very cooperative and sometimes not. And our final signature. Last sewing station. The binding will usually feel a little bit more snug at this point. That's normal. But you should have enough room to finish properly. just make sure you avoid things like that. And that you remember to do the decorative stitch. I like to give realistic demos, so I'm going to try to sew back out this hole. If I can't do that, it looks like it's going to be a little bit sneaky. Okay. Usually happens, you get excited that you get close to the end, and then you mess things up. All right, our decorative stitch, so it's going to be over here this time. I'm just trying to repeat the thing that I did before. And if you're worried like, oh, it's over there, just scoot it over here. It'll scoot itself over in a second. You can fuss with that later. Just make sure you're tightening each pamphlet as you sew it. And then tie your square knot. And with these decorative parts, you can kind of squeeze them wherever you want them to make them look nice. You can leave those as just solid bars, or sometimes what I'll do is I'll come in with my thread and you can do a little knot in here. I'll do a little quick. You could do something like that if you'd like and tie in a little knot. That's completely fine. Sometimes I'll go a couple times around to do this. And then I'll tie a little square knot there. That's an option too, if you like to do that. It always looks kind of sweet, I think. I've also seen people do weavings in this portion. And really, it's quite the opportunity to do all sorts of things. And I've stretched all those threads out in a strange way. I'm gonna go back in and kind of pull that slack back into the book. It's at the short end, right? So to pull that slack back in, I'm just gonna kind of tug at the shorter side here of this thread. And that should fix that issue that I created. Last couple of steps are just finishing, giving this cover a little trim. If you had more excess, you can always mark this, and instead of cutting it, you can fold it back in, or fold it back in and trim if you need to. And then these wings, usually there's a few solutions for them. Of course, you can use adhesive to glue those down. You can use double-sided tape to tack mount them. You could always punch a little bit of a tab on here. So I'm gonna do just some tricky finish work, and then I will post a photo.